This is the story of a boy, Johnny Wright, and his obsession with flying, his dream of being a pilot, and his journey to becoming Second Lieutenant John Wright, United States Air Force.
Welcome to another episode on the Joel Wright 2 channel. This video will tell a story of how my dad got his pilot's wings and his commission into the United States Air Force. Now, my dad received his commission and his wings through the Aviation Cadet program, which is a pilot training program that doesn't exist in the Air Force anymore, and it hasn't for over 60 years. But at one time, it was a very critical and important part of the Air Force's pilot training program, and I'll get more into it later. Most of the information in this video comes from a few sources, principally from my dad's memoir, The Thunder in Me, which was published in 2015, a year before he passed away. This book is no longer in print, but if you go online, Google, eBay, I'm sure there are some used copies you can find. The other source of information was a book called We Wanted Wings, which is a history of the Aviation Cadet program. I also have a lot of my dad's military personnel records, which has been a great source of information. Now, any photos you see in this video that don't have a credit are by default from my own collection, which I've inherited from my parents. For any videos or pictures that aren't mine, I've tried to give proper credit where I could find it.
Off we go into the wide blue yonder.
My dad was born and raised in San Antonio, Texas. From the time my dad knew what an airplane was, he wanted to fly. He wanted to be a pilot.
By the way, this is the only picture I've ever seen of my dad with a cat.
And for a kid who obsessed about flying and dreamed about being a pilot, there was no better place to live and grow up than San Antonio in the 1930s and 40s, because during that era, San Antonio was the center for Army aviation. And by Army aviation, I mean the Army Air Service, followed by the Army Air Corps, followed by the Army Air Forces. In fact, for a period of time between 1922 and the start of World War II, San Antonio was actually the sole place where the Army conducted pilot training. During this time, San Antonio was ringed by Army airfields. There was Kelly Airfield to the southwest of the city. There was Brooks Airfield to the southeast of the city. Randolph Airfield was to the northeast. And then during World War II, the Army Air Forces appropriated two civilian airfields, Stinson Airfield and Alamo Airfield, which is where the International Airport is located today. Those two civilian airfields were appropriated by the government to do more pilot training during World War II. So there was flying going on constantly during this time when my dad was growing up. When he was a kid, he would take his bike and bicycle down to Brooks Airfield to watch planes fly. Then he would spend a lot of time at Randolph Airfield. He had an uncle by marriage who was an officer in the Army Air Corps who was stationed at Randolph for a time when he was growing up in San Antonio.
This is a photo taken in 1940 of my dad's aunt and uncle. The lady in the striped blouse is his Aunt Mary Esther, who was the older sister to my dad's mother. Her husband, Volley Burkett, is standing to her right. My dad's uncle later served in World War II. And then in the same picture, here's my dad in the striped shirt holding some kid. I think it's one of his cousins. He would have been 10 years old at this time.
So he would go out to Randolph a lot and spend some time with his aunt and uncle. And he would watch the aviation cadets march around. He would watch the airplanes fly. Then at the end of the day, when the planes were being pushed back into the hangars for the evening, he would actually go out and jump in the planes while they were being pushed into the hangars by the maintenance personnel and pretend to fly the airplane. It's just a different era. There's no way that would happen today, obviously. But back then, different times, a kid could roam the ramp and just kind of do what he wanted to do. So he was constantly trying to get as close to airplanes as possible when he was a kid.
Off we go into the wide blue yonder.
So his whole goal growing up was to figure out a way to get to be a pilot. So in high school, he joined the junior ROTC program. And then the craziest story is while he was still in high school, in fact, a junior in high school, he enlisted in the Texas Army National Guard. The only problem was he was too young to enlist in the Army National Guard. He was only 16, but when he signed the enlisted papers, he lied about his birthday and made himself look like he was actually 18 by backdating his birth date by 2 years. So all the time he was in the Army National Guard, they thought he was 18 years old. He was really 16. So here he is, enlisted in the 141st Infantry Regiment of the 36th Infantry Division, running around in jeeps with 30 caliber machine guns. He's a 16-year-old. He's a junior in high school. The incredible thing is that my grandmother apparently didn't know any of this was going on, probably because she thought maybe his National Guard stuff was part of his junior ROTC stuff. My dad had a high degree of autonomy when he was growing up in the 30s and 40s. By his own admission, his mother didn't know what he was doing about probably 95% of the time. But that story is absolutely true because it's all here in his military personnel records that show that he lied on his enlistment papers with the National Guard about his birth date. Now, as a postscript, when he transferred into the Texas Air National Guard, his birth date was corrected. Still, it's a crazy story. When the Air Force became an independent military branch, he later transferred from the Texas Army National Guard into the Texas Air National Guard, where he was assigned to the 182nd Fighter Squadron as a weather observer. This was at Brooks Airfield. The 182nd was flying P-51Ds at the time. So his knowledge of weather phenomena as a Air National Guardsman actually proved to be pretty useful later on in his flying career. My dad was 15 years old when World War II ended, and he was really disappointed because he thought he had missed his chance to be involved in the greatest aerial war in human history. But that didn't dampen his enthusiasm for trying to work toward his goal of getting to fly and being a pilot. As we've seen, he joined the junior ROTC program in high school. He fraudulently enlisted in the Texas National Guard at 16 years old. So while he's still in the Guard, he graduated from high school in 1948 from Breckenridge High School in San Antonio. And immediately upon graduation from high school, he went over to Randolph Field to find out what he had to do to apply to the Aviation Cadet program. And at this point, I will explain what the Aviation Cadet program was.
Off we go into the wide blue yonder.
So the Aviation Cadet program, and yes, I'm aware I changed shirts. I'm filming this over the course of a few days. So the Aviation Cadet program was a combination pilot training program / commissioning program. It lasted from World War I into the very early 60s. And it actually trained navigators and some other non-flying officers as well. But for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to concentrate on pilot training. From World War I through the early Cold War period, there was just a greater need for pilots than what West Point could push out as far as commissioned regular officers. You have to remember during the era that the Air Force was part of the Army, and even when the Air Force was independent before the Air Force Academy stood up in the mid-50s, West Point was the source of regular commissioned officers for the Air Force. But West Point also had to commission infantry officers, cavalry, armor, engineers, quartermasters, and so on. So only a part of its commissioning output was officers going to pilot training. And there weren't a lot of college ROTC programs out there at that time. So there had to be an alternative commissioning source. And this is where Aviation Cadets came in.
So between the period from World War I through the 1950s, Aviation Cadets was the primary commissioning source for pilots in the Air Force.
There were two sources for Aviation Cadets. At times, it took in active duty enlisted personnel who met certain qualifications, and it also took in civilians. The core syllabus changed a little bit during its lifetime, but in general, it was a year-long pilot training school. And at the end of that year, you were commissioned a second lieutenant in the reserves, and you got your pilot's wings. Sometimes there was an active duty service commitment, sometimes there wasn't. Now, during my dad's time when he went through Aviation Cadets, the course started off with a 4-week pre-flight school in which theories of flight was taught. There was a lot of basic military type of training. Then you had a 6-month basic flying training in which you were taught to fly in a basic trainer. In this case, in my dad's case, it was a North American T-6 Texan. It was a 2-seat propeller-driven trainer. Then if you succeeded in passing basic flying training after 6 months, then you were split off into either a fighter track or multi-engine track. For those going through the fighter track, They were sent to another 6 months of advanced training in which they flew in a single-engine advanced trainer. During my dad's era, that advanced trainer was the Lockheed T-33, which was a single-engine, two-seat jet trainer. And once you mastered the T-33, then you would go and fly, as part of your advanced training, you would fly the Lockheed F-80, from which the T-33 was derived. The qualifications for applying to aviation cadets varied, but again, during my dad's time, you had to have, if you were a civilian going directly into aviation cadets, you had to have at least 2 years of college and had to be unmarried. And of course, you had to meet the physical requirements as well. Probably the most famous person to go through aviation cadets was Charles Lindbergh, the man who made the first solo flight across the Atlantic. Before he made that historic flight, he went through aviation cadets during the 1924-1925 period. After successfully completing a year-long training, he was commissioned a second lieutenant in the Army Air Service Reserves and earned his pilot's wings. I don't know how many flight hours you racked up after a year of training during my dad's era. I do know during the late 30s, once you completed your year-long training and earned your wings and got your commission, you would have accumulated about 325 hours in flight time, both in the basic and advanced trainers. The washout rate in aviation cadets could be quite high. For instance, during Charles Lindbergh's year-long training, he was part of a class of 104 cadets that entered training. At the end of his year of training, he was one of only 18 that survived. During my dad's time in aviation cadets, the washout rate was a little over 50%. The Air Force tried planning on a 30% washout rate during the early Cold War period, but that didn't seem to always happen.
Off we go into the wide blue yonder.
So if you recall, I mentioned earlier that once my dad graduated from high school in 1948, he went directly to Randolph Field to find out how he could get into aviation cadets. And he was told, well, since you're a civilian, you need at least 2 years of college. And they kind of told him the classes he needed to take, kind of heavy on mathematics, some English, et cetera, et cetera. So my dad promptly enrolled in San Antonio College, and I happened to have a copy of his college transcript from 1948 through 1950. So let's see what kind of classes he took. He took algebra, English composition, history of the U.S., physics, trigonometry, U.S. and Texas government, introduction to psychology, geometry, child psychology. So as you can see, his course load during the 2 years he was at San Antonio College were kind of heavy on math. And I will say, based on the grades he got, math was not exactly his strong suit. All right, so for 2 years, from 1948 to 1950, my dad went to San Antonio College to rack up enough coursework to be able to apply for aviation cadets. Now keep in mind that while he's going to school, he's still in the Texas Air National Guard as a weather observer in the 182nd Fighter Squadron. Now during his time in the Guard, he is using every opportunity he can to get to fly in airplanes. He was known as a ramp rat. He let it be known that if there was a back seat available or if there was an empty seat available in an airplane, he wanted to go up and fly with the pilots. So the pilots knew that if they had an empty seat in a plane, whether it was a trainer or a cargo plane or whatever, to let Johnny Wright know so he could go fly with them. In the summer of 1950, as soon as my dad completed his 2 years of college courses, he immediately applied for aviation cadets. Now, he met the academic qualifications. You just had to have at least 2 years of college. Now, the physical/medical part of the application for aviation cadets was not a problem for my dad, except for one thing, and that was flat feet. At this time, the military disqualified anyone who had flat feet, the theory being that people who had flat feet were more prone to having foot problems. And my dad had flat feet. Now, he knew about this prohibition about flat feet in the military. So before he even applied, he practiced having an arch on his feet by rolling his feet over Coke bottles. So when it came time for the part of the physical where they tested to see if you had flat feet or not, my dad was prepared to fake arches. What they would do for the part of the physical for testing to see if you had flat feet or not is they would have you hold in each hand a bucket of sand, and they would make you walk barefoot on an ink blotter,
and then you would step off, and then the doctors would look and see on the ink blotter what kind of arch you had. So because my dad had practiced so much walking over Coke bottles and perfecting the fake arch, he apparently was able to fake his way through the flat foot test and demonstrate that he had perfect arches. So in July 1950, he successfully passed his application and was accepted into the Aviation Cadet program. All he had to do was wait for a training date and his orders. Now, it just so happened that when he applied for Aviation Cadets in July of 1950, the month before that, the Korean War had started. Now, the start of the Korean War kicked off a major defense spending spree in the U.S. after years of post-World War II defense cuts and demobilization. In fact, in 1947, 1948, I believe the Air Force only produced a little over 2,000 new pilots during that time. They really wanted about 3,000 pilots. With the start of the Korean War, the Air Force figured it needed about 7,100 new pilots a year. But factoring in the attrition rate for pilot training, the Air Force really needed about 10,000 candidates to start the pilot training program in order to reach that 7,100 new pilot goal. So my dad's application to Aviation Cadets kind of happened at a fortuitous time because the Air Force really needed new pilots at that time. And of course, almost all of these brand new second lieutenant pilots were going to come through the Aviation Cadet program. While my dad was waiting for his orders to report to Aviation Cadets, again, he's still in the Texas Air National Guard. And in October of 1950, his National Guard unit, the 182nd, was federalized and ordered into active duty service and ordered to Langley Air Force Base, Virginia, where the unit would eventually convert from P-51s to Republic F-84 fighter bombers. And then after training in the F-84s, the unit would then report to Korea. Now, there was a bit of an administrative problem because my dad had never told his National Guard unit that he was applying or had applied, was accepted into the Aviation Cadet program. My dad just thought that the Air National Guard and the U.S. Air Force were just all the same thing. So about a month after arriving at Langley Air Force Base in November 1950, my dad's orders finally catch up to him, having him report to Aviation Cadet training. Of course, these orders totally blindsided his unit because they had no idea he'd even applied for Aviation Cadets. But since there was a war on and the Air Force needed pilots, his unit sent him back to San Antonio by bus so he could report to pilot training. After arriving back in San Antonio by bus, he then had to hightail it to Goodfellow Air Force Base, San Angelo, Texas, for the start of his Aviation Cadet training.
Off we go into the wide blue yonder.
In November 1950, my dad reported to the 35th, 45th Pilot Training Wing at Goodfellow Air Force Base in San Angelo, Texas, as a cadet to start his pilot training with the Aviation Cadets. Now, in 1950, Goodfellow was a relatively new Air Force base. In June 1940, San Angelo was selected by the Army as the site of a new airfield to conduct pilot training. Construction of the new Army airfield at San Angelo began in September 1940. The first phase of construction was completed in January 1941 and was turned over to the Army. And the first pilot trainees showed up in February 1941. By the end of World War II, Goodfellow had trained over 10,000 pilots. So here my dad was on the cusp of realizing his lifelong dream of becoming a pilot. But first he had to complete a year-long pilot training program, which given the washout rate would not be an easy prospect. For the first 6 months of Aviation Cadets, my dad would be learning to fly in the North American T-6 Texan, which was a two-seat, single-engine propeller aircraft. The T-6, over which 15,000 were built, was actually used as an advanced trainer during World War II. But after World War II, with the advent of jet aircraft, the T-6 was relegated to a basic trainer. In Aviation Cadets, the basic training portion of the program was notorious for its hazing. Now, the Air Force's Air Training Command officially outlawed hazing, but it still happened all the time. There's just something about college-age males that love to haze each other. In fact, hazing was so bad at times that it was actually the reason why a lot of Aviation Cadet trainees dropped out of the program because they just couldn't take it and they thought it was pointless and had nothing to do with preparing someone to be an officer and a pilot. Now, I don't know exactly how much hazing went on at Goodfellow, but my dad didn't seem to really mind it. He talks about how when the cadets arrived at Goodfellow, they were promised 3 square meals a day. Of course, what the program meant was that they had to eat in a very regimented way. When the cadets filed into the chow hall for their meals, they had to sit at the very edge of their seat. They had to bring their food up, straight up to the level of their mouth, and then straight into their mouth, chew with their mouth closed, bring their hand back over, directly over the plate, bring it back down to the plate, get some more food, bring it up like this. So this is what the Aviation Cadet program considered a square meal, was eating in this fashion. And meals had to be eaten very fast. There was very little time to eat. During basic flying training, my dad's days were interspersed with lots of ground school and flying, of course. He learned to eventually solo in the T-6, and after soloing, he was sent on lots of cross countries to hone his flying skills. There was training in formation flying. He had to learn how to navigate. There was training on flying by instruments only, and they would do this by having the instructor pilot sit in the front seat, the student would sit in the back seat of the T-6, and in the back cockpit portion of the T-6, the student would be covered by a hood, and he'd have to learn how to fly totally by instrument. The instructor pilot was up front just to make sure that there were no other airplanes in the way. They had to learn how to recover from spins and stalls. The training wasn't easy. There were a couple times when my dad thought he was going to wash out for sure or do worse. It actually took him longer than his peers to solo in the T-6, something that greatly frustrated him. And there was one occasion where he took the T-6 up on a solo flight to practice recovering from spins. He took the T-6 up to 11,000 feet, put the plane into a stall, began to spin, and then couldn't get out of the spin. No matter what he did, he couldn't get out of the spin. And in fact, the plane spun out of control for 10,000 feet before he was able to recover from the spin. That shook him up pretty badly. But my dad attributed a lot of his success in basic flying training to his instructor pilot, a Lieutenant Singleton, who my dad described as very patient and understanding and very wise. On June 22nd, 1951, my dad successfully completed the basic pilot training part of his Aviation Cadet program, graduated fairly high in his class, and was selected to go to the fighter track and was sent to Williams Air Force Base near Phoenix, Arizona for his advanced training. My dad arrived at Williams Air Force Base in the summer of 1951 for 6 months of advanced training, during which he would learn to fly a jet fighter. Now, when he arrived at Williams at this time, the T-33, which was the 2-seat single-engine jet trainer the Air Force had at the time, was in short supply. And in fact, at the time my dad got to Williams, the T-33 wasn't available right away for the cadets to train in. This meant that the cadets, instead of being able to train in the 2-seat T-33 first and then transitioning to the single-seat F-80, the cadets had to learn how to fly the single-seat F-80 right away. Now, asking cadets who have only ever flown in a T-6 to immediately start jumping into a single-seat F-80 and flying is not exactly a safe way of doing things. The Air Force recognized this, and to get around the shortage of T-33s, the Air Force employed what was known as a captive air system. This involved anchoring an F-80 to the ground on top of concrete pylons underneath the wings. The F-80 would be anchored just high enough so that the gear could fully extend and retract. In this way, cadets could get in the F-80, fire it up, and learn how to operate the systems before actually jumping into a real F-80 and flying solo. But as crazy and dangerous as it seems, my dad's first introduction to jet aircraft was having to fly solo in a single-seat F-80 without the benefit of having first trained in a 2-seat jet aircraft with an instructor pilot.
Off we go into the wide blue yonder.
So the 6 months of advanced training for my dad seemed to progress rather uneventfully. And finally, after dreaming about flying all of his life, after dreaming about wanting to become a pilot, the day finally came on December 15th, 1951 at 10:30 in the morning. My dad graduated from Aviation Cadets, received his pilot wings, and was commissioned as second lieutenant in the United States Air Force. Later that day, he also married my mom. If you remember from earlier in this video, I said that you could not be married and go through Aviation Cadets. So my parents, who were high school sweethearts, had a long engagement and had to wait until he was commissioned in order to get married. After the wedding ceremony, there was a dinner buffet honoring the graduates of Aviation Cadet Class 51H. So it was a very busy day for my parents.
Off we go into the wide blue yonder.
Now, what happened to my dad after his graduation from pilot training and his commissioning is the subject of future videos. As a postscript to this video, you might wonder what happened to Aviation Cadets. Why doesn't it exist anymore? Well, by the mid-1950s, the culture of the Air Force was starting to change. The Air Force leadership wanted a more professionalized officer corps, which means it wanted its officers to have four-year degrees upon commissioning. In 1955, the Air Force Academy stood up, which meant the Air Force finally had its own service academy. By the mid to late 50s, there were a lot more college ROTC programs available, and in the late 1950s, the Air Force stood up Officers Training School, which required civilians entering that program to have a four-year degree prior to entering OTS. Now, Officers Training School replaced an older commissioning program called Officers Candidate School, in which you didn't need a four-year degree to get a commission. So with the Air Force wanting its commissioned officers to have four-year degrees, a program like the Aviation Cadets, which didn't require a four-year degree, was seen as a relic of the past. So as a result of this newfound obsession with wanting its officers to already have degrees when they get commissioned, the Air Force reformed its pilot training program. And the Aviation Cadet program commissioned its last pilot trainee in 1961. But as it turns out, for the vast majority of my dad's career, he only had 2 years of college. He didn't get a four-year degree until after he made full colonel. All right, so I hope you enjoyed this look at my dad's journey from a kid who dreamed of flying to someone who actually fulfilled his dream. I hope to make more videos about my dad's career in the Air Force. All right, thanks for watching.
Yonder,